Hey there, it's me again, Michelle, and welcome back to the Canadian History of Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 40, finally brings us to the long-awaited Confederation, the unification of the colonies. This episode is part 1 of this mini-series. Now, as usual, before starting, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw in the last episode. And as a reminder, that episode was focused on the birth of British Columbia. We saw that in 1843, James Douglas built Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island at the request of the Hudson's Bay Company, and that in 1844, James Polk, President of the U.S., wanted to set the border at 54 degrees and 40 minutes of latitude, just below the Russian territory. The Canadians had suggested 45 degrees. Then the Oregon Treaty of 1846 reached a compromise, where both sides agreed to just simply extend the 49th parallel across the Rockies. But by Douglas having built his trading post at Fort Victoria, this ensured that the whole of Vancouver Island remained in British hands. Then, several gold strikes brought an influx of Americans, so Governor James Douglas took control of the mainland gold rush, and on August 2, 1858, a second crown colony was created on the mainland, named British Columbia. And as was the case in the province of Canada, newspaper men Amour de Cosmos and John Robson led the fight for self-government. Governor Douglas retired in 1864, and the new governor, Frederick Seymour, installed elected members to the Assembly, and self-government was achieved. And finally, in 1866, the two colonies, Vancouver Island and British Columbia, were joined as one colony named British Columbia, with its capital at Victoria. Okay, now that the summary is out of the way, let's continue with this video and finally start our look at Confederation. Now, the idea of uniting the colonies of British North America wasn't new. It was a concept that's been around since the Loyalists first arrived. But now, by the 1860s, several key elements came together to make the Union a reality. These elements were: 1. There was a change in British attitudes. 2. There was fear of an American invasion. 3. There was the impending loss of free trade with the United States. 4. The age of the railroad had arrived. And 5. There was dissatisfaction among English Canadians with their ineffective united parliament. Let's look at the first element, the change in British attitudes. Great Britain was still imperialistic as always, but their emphasis was now geared more towards trade and profit rather than military might and imperial monopolies. Great Britain was reinventing itself as a commercial empire, and the colonies were seen as a financial drain. So the colonies taking care of themselves as a self-governing union without leaving the empire entirely seemed ideal. Now let's look at the second element, the fear of an American invasion. Several historians noted that the fear of an American invasion during the Civil War was perhaps the leading cause of Canadian Confederation. The American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was tearing the United States apart. And although Canada did not support the slave-owning Southern Confederacy and claimed to remain neutral, she did show sympathy towards the South's desire to separate. This resulted in the U.S. government becoming anti-British. Newspapers in Chicago warned Canada, "Just wait till this war is over. You're next." 3 crises during the American Civil War in particular almost brought the battlefield to Canada. First was the Trent Crisis in November of 1861. A Union warship stopped and boarded the Trent, a British mail steamer, at gunpoint in neutral waters. The Americans arrested 2 Confederate delegates on their way to Britain. The British saw this as an act of piracy and threatened retaliation. President Abraham Lincoln released the 2 men, but an attack on Canada seemed imminent. To protect the colonies, Britain dispatched 14,000 troops to North America, the largest contingent since the War of 1812. The second crisis of the Civil War was the Alabama Affair. Although Britain claimed neutrality, it did allow the South to build a warship, the Alabama, in the Liverpool shipyard. By the time it was captured and sunk, it had caused millions of dollars of damage. The U.S. State Department claimed that by Great Britain allowing the Alabama to be built, the British had helped prolong the Civil War by 2 years. Then the U.S. government sent a bill to Britain for $4 billion, along with a suggestion that if Britain didn't want to pay up, they could always hand over Canada. The third Civil War crisis was the St. Alvins Raid. Here, the Southern Confederates decided to attack the North via the back door, through Canada. In October 1864, Confederates attacked the town of St. Albans, Vermont. They robbed a bank of $200,000, wounded 2 men, and killed a third, then fled north into Canada, where they were captured. A Montreal magistrate released the men, even giving them the money back. Of course, the U.S. government was outraged, so now the U.S. sentiment was not just anti-British, but also anti-Canadian. The St. Alvins Raid doomed any talk of free trade and open trade between the U.S. and the British colonies. Now let's see about the third element, the impending end of free trade. With Great Britain moving towards freer trade, the British North American colonies went into panic mode. Back in 1854, the colonies had worked out the Treaty of Reciprocity with the United States for freer trade. This treaty had eliminated tariffs that allowed the British to trade their fish, lumber, coal, and grain with the U.S. and was crucial for the colonies. Although trade was good, it made the colonies reliant on U.S. trade policies. Soon the treaty would be up for renewal in 1865, but current tensions made it almost certain that the Americans would let the treaty lapse and greatly impact the colonies financially. So a union of the British North American colonies made sense now. Why not create our own union and allow cross-colonial access to maritime fisheries, New Brunswick timber, Canadian factories, and the land and natural resources of the Northwest? Now let's have a look at the fourth element, the railway revolution. Looking back, if the American Civil War and the end of free trade made Confederation necessary, then the railways made it possible. Before this time, a man could travel only about 20 kilometers per day on horseback. Now, with rail, he could travel 600 kilometers or more per day. The railways made Confederation viable. The railways could bring far-off regions together. It would unite them and expand them. Before, the colonies were isolated from each other by the vast scale of the geography of Canada, but now that geography could be crossed. And the railways didn't just bring great promise, but also great profits too. And an unlikely coincidence was that many of the leading proponents of Confederation were also railway promoters. And with the military threat from the United States growing, a separate colonial railway would allow for fast troop movements. And finally, let's finish off this episode with a look at the final element, the dissatisfaction among English Canadians. The push for Confederation actually began in the United Province of Canada, where the Act of Union, enacted in February of 1841, led to political deadlocks. Rather than overpower the Canadians, the United Parliament, with its equal seats awarded to both English and French members, needed the French-Canadian voters for the English Canadians to hold any power. A conservative alliance took shape under the leadership of a young Kingston attorney, John A. Macdonald, and a Montreal-based lawyer named Georges Etienne Cartier. These two men would dominate Canadian politics for the next 30 years. Politically, the province of Canada was divided into two opposing sides, each with a French and an English-Canadian component. The Conservatives. In Canada West, John A. Macdonald's Liberal Conservative Party was a coalition of moderate and traditional Tories. In Canada East, Georges Etienne Cartier's Parti Bleu, aligned with the Church, was pro-British and anti-American. The Reformers Party, in Canada West, George Brown's Reform Party, along with a radical wing who called themselves Clear Grits. In Canada East, Antoine Aimé Daguillon's Radical Parti Rouge. As populations grew, Canada West became more populated than Canada East, and the 50-50 split of seats in government just didn't work for them. English Canadians were now getting the short end of the stick. They wanted representation by population. Of course, the members of Canada East refused this proposal, and the result was political stalemate. The only way out of deadlock was to create a union with the other British colonies. This would give Canada West its own government and their own decision-making process, as well as allowing for intercolonial trade and defense. Then on June 24th, 1864, something remarkable happened. George Brown rose in the Assembly and offered to cross the floor to end the deadlock. He would join a coalition with his political foe, John A. Macdonald, but on 3 conditions. 1, that the coalition work towards creating a larger federation of all British North American colonies. 2, that the Government of Canada and any future union be based on the democratic principle of representation by population. And 3, that the future federation expand west into the Northwest and perhaps even to the Pacific. And so it was that the Great Coalition of 1864, spearheaded by Brown, Macdonald, and Cartier, would become the driving force behind Confederation. Well, on that very promising note, let's end this episode here. Please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 41, Confederation Part 2, where we look at the blueprint for a nation. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, give this video a thumbs up. And click that subscribe button below to see more. And remember to hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.